Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's virtual meeting. We're excited, very excited, to be joined by the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, and we are prepared for a very vigorous meeting. You'll have the opportunity to hear more about her vision for the global economy and the fund's role in helping the recovery, and they are very, very progressive, moving forward in a vigorous way. And afterwards, we'll take your questions in Q&A session moderated by the Chamber's Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs, Myron Brilliant. But first, I'd like to step back and consider the extent of the challenges facing our international systems at this time. As we look at the history of the United States, the challenges we face today are not unlike others our nation and others have confronted in the past. In 1918, a deadly pandemic. In the 30s, a crippling depression and massive unemployment. And in the 1960s, widespread civil unrest. What's different about this moment is that they are happening all at once, and they are happening in an increasingly interconnected world. Over the past few months, we have seen some of the risks that come with that reality. Shutdowns in commerce have contributed to global contraction that makes our interconnected economy increasingly fragile. But we have also seen some of the opportunities that only this system could provide. The international system is what creates opportunities for American businesses to expand, hire, and help grow our economy through trade and global cooperation, as well as competition leads to breakthroughs that would not be possible in an isolated world. International cooperation and strong government and global alliances are needed not only to find a vaccine, but also to keep the supply chain stable and secure and trade flows going ahead so that we can move the vaccine to where it's needed. There are some who believe that now is a good time to turn inward. They're just plain wrong. We learned that lesson the hard way in the 30s. A protectionist response to the Great Depression intensified that crisis and deepened the suffering for millions. On the other hand, the trade liberalization after World War II, including the founding of the IMF, helped unleash the greatest period of global growth in history. Since its founding, the IMF has helped stabilize and strengthen the global economy through many crises, and it is stepping up again under Kristalina's leadership. But the IMF is not a standalone body. It is the communal instrument of nations, and we recognize the United States' responsibility for continued leadership to ensure the fund's success. The Chamber has always been a proponent of additional resources for the fund because we know that our investment is buying the best insurance policy for ourselves and the world, one that has been tried and tested many times. Beyond ensuring global stability, the IMF is stepping forward to imagine a more environmentally friendly and economically resistant future. Our country needs to stand in support of the fund and help it build a future that envisions one that includes stronger systems that underpin the delivery of healthcare, environmental stewardship, social engagement, and economic vitality. U.S. business has a lot to offer, in making the IMF's positive vision a reality. And we want to work with the fund to lead the world out of this very challenging moment. To hear more about what the IMF is doing and how the business community can help, I'd like to officially welcome its managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, and look forward to her contribution today. Just before we went on air, we had a chance to exchange a few views, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of work going on at the IMF that we're all benefiting from, and we're very excited to be all together today. And I welcome our speaker, the managing director of the IMF. Please, let's go forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. It is so wonderful to have a chance to talk to your global audience. U.S. companies play a huge role, of course, here in the United States, but also all over the world. We have been partners over decades. We are united on a simple concept that private sector-led growth improves opportunities for people everywhere. We at the fund have been concentrated on the macroeconomic policies that underpin private sector-led growth. As you said, we also stepped up a number of times in a period of crisis to steer a recovery and bring countries back into a pathway of growth and jobs. As you probably know, I spent a big chunk of my life living in a non-market economy. I was born and educated in Bulgaria during the times of communism. And I can tell you, there isn't a stronger advocate for markets than somebody who has lived in a non-market, highly distorted environment. I learned firsthand the cost of bad policies, the benefits of good policies, and it is actually due to the IMF in the early 90s that my country turned a course to a inclusion into first the European Union and of course the world economy. And I'm saying this because I still every so often have to pinch myself, especially now talking to your audience. Is it really a reality that somebody who came from there now leads the IMF? And it tells us a very simple story that change for the better is unstoppable, but it is not an easy and even road from here to there. So let me concentrate my opening remarks on 3 points. First, what we have learned about this highly unusual crisis. Second, how we envisage the pathway to recovery. And third, what is the role of the IMF? Starting from the crisis, simple facts. For 170 countries, the end of 2020 would mean them having a smaller economy than they had in January of this year. And this is the exact reversal of where we were in January when those of us who were in Davos, remember we were talking about 160 countries finishing the year with a larger economy with a positive per capita income growth. Never ever in our history we have seen such a tremendous reversal of fortunes for so many. We have never had a truly global crisis as the one we have now. We named it the Great Lockdown because we are fighting a health emergency by bringing production and consumption to a standstill. Again, never done before. But more importantly than that, what we learned in this crisis is also that over the years, we have come to a point when governments are able, in a synchronized manner, to take very decisive action at the time of crisis. I know that there is a degree of disappointment that it is not done in a more coordinated fashion. Nonetheless, what has been done to put a floor under the national economies and as a result under the world economy is absolutely remarkable. We got major central banks acting in a very forceful manner. In the United States, the Fed has done miracles in terms of providing liquidity and bringing down the temperature in markets to a point that now markets are blossoming, and this may be a question we can come down later on. What does it mean at the time of recession to have that kind of market exuberance? We also had very, very massive fiscal measures totaling $9 trillion. And these have provided lifelines to businesses. I must say we assess these measures to be well targeted. Most of them are well thought through to be temporary. And as such, they are a bridge to the recovery, but not a risk for the recovery as it comes. Let me stress that by taking that kind of decisive action domestically, major central banks in particular, but also governments putting fiscal measures in place, have eased the pressure on emerging markets with good fundamentals. We draw a very important lesson from the fact that countries that have over the years built sound buffers and sound macroeconomic policies in this time of crisis weather much better than those who have not done it. In March, many of you may remember we were incredibly worried that in flight to safety, some $100 billion left emerging markets and developing countries, 3 times more than during the global financial crisis. But then in April and May, because of this massive injection of liquidity in advanced economies, emerging markets were able to go back, issue bonds in very competitive yields with a very, very favorable costs. $77 billion issuance. If we compare to the same 2 months last year, this is almost 3.5 times more, obviously under the pressure to keep their own economies stable and growing. What we need to recognize, though, that for countries that are either in high debt distress or are affected by fragility, by conflicts, by underlying bad conditions, the crisis is horrifying. The same way people with weak immune systems are more at risk to the coronavirus, weak economies are much more at risk to the economic shock it has created. What we are seeing also is that now, with health systems being built to be able to cope with the increased number of people seeking health assistance, with us learning how to function at the time of pandemic, more social distancing, wearing of masks, with companies, and this is you, very quickly adopting micro measures to be able to reopen, to function in this still charged times. The process of reopening is progressing across the globe. Some 75% of countries are reopening. And that is the right time to think big about what is coming next. And what is not coming next is a recovery that we have to choose what to make out of it. Do we want it to be a recovery, as many would say, there is this very popular phrase now, build back better? Or we want it to be a recovery that is not about building back. It is about building forward. It is about a great transformation coming out of this exceptional crisis. At the IMF, we are concentrating now our attention on the risks and opportunities that the recovery will present. On the risk side, very clearly, we would come on the other side of this crisis with more debt, higher deficits, very likely higher structural unemployment, in other words, unemployment in sectors that are shrinking on a more permanent basis, and higher poverty. And these are risks we have to think carefully how to mitigate with right economic policies. We have learned through the decades how to do that, how to address debt, deficits, unemployment, and poverty. And we need to do that again. We need to do it on a scale. For example, talking about the issue of debt, yes, interest rates are low. This is great news. Governments can carry more debt, companies as well. But we have to think about that carrying capacity over time, and measures have to be in place to bring more sustainability. I'm very keen to talk about the opportunities because they are right in our face, not to be missed. The first and most important one is the digital transformation, the big winner of this crisis. We were talking with Tom about our own institutions. We are not going to go back to the way we worked before the pandemic. Now that we know we can telecommute effectively, we know that we can have a organization of work that is much more flexible and more accommodative of our staff's conditions and preferences. So we are going to be very rapidly modernizing how we operate, and we would see tremendous expansion of e-commerce, e-learning, e-transfers, e-payments, e-governance. And this last one is particularly important. We would like to see much more transparency and accountability in governance, as well as in the way the economy functions. And for that, critical to make sure that we are not going to move into a great divide in which the access to digital is limited for some and unlimited for others. Right now, just to give you one example, many of you know it, only 50%, 50 of African businesses, African citizens have access to the internet. Well, if that doesn't change, the big opportunity of moving towards digital is going to be an opportunity missed. And it would lead us into deepening inequality within countries and across countries. Same here in the United States, rural America can be much more connected than it is today. The second huge opportunity is going green. It was on our minds before this crisis, and it should come higher as we are in the midst of this pandemic. I always tell people, if you don't like the pandemic, believe you me, you're not going to like climate change as it hits us with a increasing strength in the future. The great thing about green, and that has been proven by many, including a commission in which the business was very heavily engaged on the new climate economy, is that it can offer job-rich opportunities. For example, in building insulation, in reforestation, mangroves restoration, in moving urban to a more livable place. There is a lot that can be done that is good also for job creation, and also moving in low carbon in energy and infrastructure can be a big boost for jobs, not only for moving green. We at the fund are very keenly interested to provide the incentives for countries and companies to move faster in that direction, including by being clear around the risks to businesses from transitional risks and nature risks, making sure that in your portfolios, in your companies, you can see them, you can assess them, and of course, looking at what fiscal measures can be put in place to incentivize transition to a green economy. And finally, something that Tom talked about in the beginning, the fact that we have so many people on the streets protesting against massively against racial discrimination. But let's remember last year, 2019, we had massive unrest that was driven by, broadly speaking, inequality of opportunities, by a sense of exclusion. If we are to have a sustainable future, sustainable businesses, we ought to be concerned about the fairness of our societies. IMF research shows two things. One is good, the other one is very concerning. The good thing is that there are policies that are good for growth and good for dealing with inequalities. For example, combining social safety nets with what I would call social safety ropes, a chance to move up, to be helped to succeed. And that goes especially for small and medium-sized businesses. The bad news is that after pandemic, inequality tends to go up. And the bad news is also that inequality damages society. So we have to put this squarely on our radar screen. And let me finish with the point that Tom also made, the importance of global trade, the significance it has for us, to put it very simply, to have lower costs, higher incomes, and less poverty. There would be a natural tendency after this pandemic for some retreat, to build more health security, to build more independence of operations. I hope it is not going to lead to a dramatic retrieval from what has served us so well for so long. And let me finish with a word on the fund. We stepped up massively. We have $1 trillion lending capacity, to a certain degree thanks to you, to your activism for a strong fund. We had only 250 billion just before the global financial crisis, learned a lesson, we have 4 times more. And we are deploying massively this resource in emergency financing, as well as in provision of flexible credit lines to countries with strong fundamentals. We have done a lot, and obviously we are poised to do more. And today I very much look forward to hear from you what this more should be for the fund to make its contribution to the recovery. Thank you.
Kristalina, that was terrific, and gave me plenty of room to maneuver in this question session with you. Before I open it up, I want to remind everyone that we have a chat room, and we encourage you to put your questions there. This is a great platform for us to hear how the business community can help and work with the IMF and multilateral organizations in the recovery that is so important to us, not just in the United States, but around the world. So Kristalina, I have a lot of questions for you, and then I want to make sure I get to the audience as well. So let me just jump right into it. You referenced some of the tools in your toolkit. You talked about the $100 trillion, the $1 trillion you have in assets, and certainly 100+ countries have come to the IMF requesting emergency funding. How are you making decisions? How are you prioritizing when there's such a great demand and need, and there is such a requirement for also the private sector and for governments to think about debt forbearance? How is the IMF prioritizing in this environment decisions with respect to countries seeking lines of credit and other tools from the IMF?
Well, thank you for this question, Byron. When it comes down to provision of emergency financing, what we are looking into is to what extent the country is at risk of being hit severely by the crisis, and vast majority of the countries coming to us are at high risk. And then we apply two screens. The first one is what we call our safeguards. We want to be sure that we have sufficient data to ascertain how the money is going to flow and be applied to the priorities of the country. And the second one is what we call letter of intent. What is the country's intent to deploy this money? And there we say, very simply, please spend for your doctors, your nurses, your hospitals, and for the parts of the economy that are most vulnerable, the people that are most vulnerable. We have been incredibly fast. In just over 6 weeks, we have approved 68 of these requests. And these are virtually lifelines for countries. Whether we are talking about a country like Ghana that has had access to markets and found itself in a very tough spot because of the crisis, or we talk about a country like Rwanda with very good fundamentals, has been doing well, but it is severely hit, or Nigeria, where the situation dramatically worsened once the country was hit by both low oil prices and the domestic lockdown plus spillovers from other places. We also are taking receiving requests from strong countries with strong fundamentals to have an additional insurance in this time of uncertainty. We just approved 2 flexible credit lines to Chile and Peru. We call these countries platinum borrowers, just because they have done so well to build these strong policy fundamentals. And we have a number of countries that are coming with demands for their traditional programs, like Ukraine. We are of course taking into account the critical environment in which we are. We created a new instrument. We call it short-term liquidity line. It is a complement to countries with strong fundamentals to have an ease to tap into the fund's resources. And we did something very important, Myron. We recognize that the hardest hit countries are the low-income countries and also countries with high level of debt. So we have tripled our concessional financing to be able to do for them what advanced economies can do for themselves, boost liquidity very quickly. And actually, if I may, we are also very active on debt relief. We provide debt relief to our own members, to the poorest members. We provide grants with which they serve their obligations to the fund 27 countries can do that. And together with the president of the World Bank, David Malpass, we called for a debt standstill, now known as the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, that G20 countries have adopted. Absolutely critical for countries with high level of debt and very weak economies.
Let me move on because we have so much to cover. So, Kristalina, let me ask you, you talked about the vulnerability of poor segments of society in a pandemic and in past pandemics and experiences. This has been always a big issue for the IMF, for countries to grapple with. How do you see the business community and the governments working with the IMF to address inequality? You talked about it, you touched upon it, but what do you think are the things that we should be thinking about in particular in terms of policy prescriptions?
Well, the two things that came out of this crisis that I believe would be internalized in policies in the future. One, the necessity to invest in people. The same way the global financial crisis taught us to build strong banking sector, this crisis is teaching us to have strong health systems. And I would go a step beyond, also to have strong educational systems. Right now, in many countries, kids who do not have access to the internet are losing a year of schooling. When we talk about girls, the probability of them not going back to school is much higher than for boys. So they may be out of school. Just imagine the loss of productivity for the nation and the loss of opportunity for these children. So investing in people ought to become a pillar of policies in which countries think of this not as a cost, not as expenditure, but think of it as investment. By the way, the World Bank did an analysis of wealth, the sources of wealth in the world. They calculated the total wealth of our planet. And to my surprise even, and the surprise of many, 2/3 of the global wealth is us. It is people. And countries that have invested more in their people, they're richer. So that is the first, I would say, the most important issue if we want inequality to shrink, is to make sure we make this investment. And secondly, as we think about the stimulus that inevitably countries need to concentrate on, it has to be thoughtfully directed to the part of our working class of our labor that is most severely impacted. Low skills, they are severely hit by the shrinkage of jobs in hospitality, in transport, in the areas that we see them most affected, and in developing countries, informal work, but also informal businesses. So how to go about more inclusive economy in which businesses have access to credits, they get into the formal economy, and actually how to get countries to concentrate on domestic resource mobilization. And this is where businesses would be very helpful. Advocate for fair. I know that when I say the word tax, some of you may say, oh God, here they go. But if we want the society to function and businesses to prosper, there has to be the basic provision of services, and it cannot be funded otherwise than the government to collect taxes. Nigeria has 8% tax to GDP ratio. Well, how is the country going to be great in terms of businesses and prosperity? We are saying minimum 15%. And strive to do a little better. So there are ways in which policies can be more inclusive, and at the same time business friendly. And that is what the fund is advocating for.
So clearly, one of the big challenges we face in business is the informal economy. And you mentioned the impact on some of these fragile states about making sure there is inclusive recovery for people in the country. But a lot of these countries are not only hit hard because of the informal sector has been hit hard, they're also hit hard because commodity prices are weaker. We've seen a big drop in crude oil prices. And some of the countries where the economic recovery, frankly, is uneven, are so dependent on these natural resources for their recovery. And yet you're also talking about a growth agenda that isn't just an inclusive one, but also looks at environmental concerns and considerations. How do we balance that? How does the IMF balance that? Because these countries do require, their immediate need is to be able to export more of their commodities, more of their oil, and yet they've been hit so hard by the decrease in prices. How do we balance that?
Well, let me recognize how important your question is. For emerging markets in developing countries that are commodity exporters, this has been a big part of the shock they're experiencing, the drop in commodity prices. We have seen some recovery, but by far not enough to help them square this circle, to have the revenues. So they, on one side, they need more money because their economy is in standstill. They need to spend more for their doctors, and on the other side, their revenues are sinking. So what we remind countries is that they do need to think about diversification of the economy over time. This is a message you have heard the IMF, the World Bank, many to articulate, and I do believe now is the time for especially development banks, as they think of their investments in developing countries that are highly dependent on commodity exports, to emphasize even more the necessity to diversify. Meanwhile, this is where we step in with massive emergency financing. It is critical not to drive these countries in a down spiral, produce and export even more, meaning that prices may go even further down. We have seen the danger of this when it comes down to oil. Now it is to a certain degree behind us. What countries rely on, and we are providing it on a massive scale, is to have this cushion, this lifeline that allows them to steer through this time of low commodity prices and low domestic production of any kind. We would see some countries actually coming well because their commodities are those that are linked to the digital economy. And there would be countries that need to think long term, that what they export, if they're coal exporters, and I would say even if we look at the oil, what would the economy of the future look like 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road? And how you realign so you have that capacity to weather better. I worked for a number of years in Russia. I can tell you that this theme of diversification in any commodity-dependent economy is high on the agenda, but not so easy to do. I personally believe that now is the moment for governments to put very strong incentives for diversification. Use your stimulus to direct the economy to the future.
Tom, thank you, Christina, for that answer. Tom and you both talked about the importance of trade, and we have seen certainly a decrease in trade volumes in the first part of the year, and we should expect that through the second quarter. And yet we would all agree that trade has brought a lot of people out of poverty. Going forward, you talked about this, the importance of linking trade policies and trade activity with environmental resiliency and the importance of thinking through sustainability as we also think about keeping our community globally connected. And digital transformation is a part of that. But how do you see the policy prescriptions in this area? Because this is obviously, there are divergent views about environmental expectations, but there's also a need to look at the link of trade and the environment. They can work together. So how do we do that?
Well, let me first say very clearly that even before this pandemic, there was disillusionment with globalization among people in countries rich and poor. And the reason for this disillusionment was that there was that sense that globalization, trade, bring benefits, more benefits for some at the cost of others. So it is important in domestic policies as well as we think about trade in the future to recognize that there has to be a way in which communities do not suffer unintended consequences of expanding global trade. And we also have to recognize that our trade system was falling behind the course of time. Services are not included. E-commerce, which is going to be blossoming, not included. Technology transfer, you know the problems around that. If we are to give a boost to trade, we have to find a way to address these shortcomings. Otherwise, it would be tough to do what is right. But we also have to be speaking much more clearly about the unintended consequences of retrieving from trade. Very simple fact. Who benefits from trade the most, the rich or the poor? Well, it is poor households that benefit the most from globally integrated economy. For them, the cost of goods they purchase drop by 3/4. This is a tremendous benefit. For the rich, they also drop by 1/3 because of this differences in consumer baskets. So we have a duty to lead the world towards resolving the problems that we have, but not wavering from the benefits of trade. We do not want to go back, Tom said it so clearly, to where the world was. This great lockdown must not lead to great protectionism, because if that happens, we know what the implications are going to be. We will be poorer. We will see costs going up. The benefits of technological advancements are not going to flow to the poor countries as they should. And it would be a world that would be, unfortunately, also a less secure world. So a lot to do. Let's hope that we would see a selection process for the for WTO that leads to a re-energized institution. And here at the fund, we will continue relentlessly our research. We want to bring evidence, not phrases, not talk, evidence why this is so important.
Well, you said it, Kristalina. International commerce has got to be a driver of the economic recovery around the world, but it has to be also done in a way that is sustainable and reflects some of the shifting priorities and the realities that we face today.
And I'm sorry, I didn't answer this very important part of your question. Yes. It is really, when we think about trade, one of the issues that we have to be mindful of is that we cannot get to a point in which we can transfer pollution from one place to another. We cannot deal with climate change unless there is integrity in the global community. We have seen the business benefits of sustainability. We know them. Let me just, you know it very well. Let me just stress three. One, companies that are committed to sustainability and to more inclusive growth, they by and large do better. We know that there are businesses that benefit tremendously from environmentally sustainable practices, whether we talk about fisheries, the health of our oceans, we talk about sustainable agriculture and our food security, or we talk about the opportunities of climate mitigation. These are all fantastic business opportunities. And we also know that unless we act collectively, we do face the risk of a new form of tariffs. The Europeans are talking about border tax related to protecting their industries against those that do not take climate measures seriously, which would create yet another avenue for attack on what is so valuable for us, and it is open and inclusive trade.
Well, I mean, I think our concern from the business standpoint, Kristalina, is the fragmentation of policies.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The markets will reflect those policies, and we're concerned that there will be fragmentation, and that's why I wanted to put out there that as we think about our international trade regimes, we need to look outward and not inward always. It's very important that we remain connected through the G20, through the multilateral institutions, through the WTO, through the IMF, and many others. And that's, I think, the emphasis that the IMF's role has always been. But one of the concerns we all have is that people will draw the wrong conclusions from the pandemic. I wanted to move on back to the concerns around the debt in developing countries. And one continent in particular is Africa. I wanted to draw your attention to. There is no question that the poorer countries around the world have to be part of the sustainable recovery, or the world economy will suffer. And there's no question that there'll be a role for public debt forgiveness. How do you see that playing out at a time when there is not consistency of policy between Europe, United States, China, and many of the major actors that have to play a role here? I'm being diplomatic in my question, but you know that this is such an important issue.
I recognize that. Let's remember that the concerns about debt levels going up and up and up were there before the pandemic. The fund repeatedly would say we have an increase of countries in debt distress. Among the poor countries just before the pandemic, 40% of them were in debt distress. And it was like, a frog in a boiling water. The temperature goes up and up and up. The frog is still kind of comfortable, but we know what happens unless the frog jumps out of the water. And I very much hope that the pandemic is this, clap of hands that makes the frog jump out. Because all of a sudden this issue of debt distress has become much more dramatically worse, with economies coming to stand still. In Africa, in particular, not only in Africa, but in Africa in particular, this debt service suspension initiative is incredibly important. What the G20 have agreed, and I actually want to take 20 seconds to praise the G20. First time ever, the Paris Club, an old and respected institution, and the non-Paris Club members came together and agreed on debt suspension. This is potentially for some 73 countries. As of now, about half of them have requested participation in the initiative. There are some that have solitude that unlikely to participate, and they're eligible, but they don't need it. And there are some that are hesitant because they worry about their access to markets. They worry that this may push them back in market accessibility. We have to work on all these issues. We need to make sure that private sector joins the public official creditors in this debt service suspension. Why? Because it gives us valuable time to then concentrate on a case-by-case basis on these countries where debt sustainability needs to be restored with the help of debt restructuring. We do not want this to be massive, and we do not want it to be ill-prepared. So we will have to zero on carefully on a case-by-case basis, and then see where we go. But unless we do it, as you know very well, what it would lead to inevitably is a much worse option, which is disorderly defaults. And we can prevent that. And my institution is very firmly committed to work with the World Bank, to work with the G20. So we have a well thought through process that is fair to everybody, fair to the creditors, fair to the countries, fair to the world that needs more than ever needs a collaborative approach to our problems.
Kristalina, in the sense the IMF is on the front line, but it's also on a backstop for the international system. Let me take a question from the audience, which is really, when you're in the middle of a fire, it's just about putting out the fires, and hopefully you're also thinking about the road ahead. But given the massive economic effects of the responses to the pandemic, this person's asking, will the IMF perform a comprehensive, in-depth, detailed review of the responses worldwide? And will that review be used to look at specific actions and policy prescriptions the IMF will consider making to governments going forward? So if in the event of another pandemic, you have an enhanced toolkit, but also a enhanced set of recommendations at the outset to help governments mitigate the worst of these situations. So basically, you're in the middle of a fire. Can you start to do the planning for the next series of challenges you face?
This is really a great question. From the very beginning of this crisis, when the world was still not yet quite awakened to what is to come, we did two things. One, to gear up for emergency financing, and two, to create a policy action tracker for all countries. So you go on our website and you would find for 193 countries tracking actions they're taking in response to the pandemic. We are now going to expand it to also cover measures they take to reopen, how they do it, so countries can learn from each other in real time. And of course, we are going to use this data to then step back and draw some conclusions. And then on the basis of these conclusions, of course, that would impact our own policies, and it would impact the way we advise countries on their policies. So the answer is, in one word, yes.
Okay. Here's another question, and I want Tom and myself to be thinking very carefully about your answer here. The fund favors a transition to sustainability, and you've talked, and people at the IMF have talked a lot about carbon taxes. But the question is premised that this may not be a good moment for taxes generally. How important is public investment, tax incentives as opposed to taxes, the labor market reforms, the public-supported green finance, and the repurposing of subsidies in fund, really critical for your thinking at the IMF. So are there other things that we should be thinking about, a package of things, rather than carbon taxes that would be helpful to ensure the growth that you're talking about that is needed, the inclusive growth?
Obviously, we have to pursue a comprehensive approach, and we need to look at both revenues, how we raise them, and then expenditures, how we insensitize the right expenditures for this transformation I was talking about. On the revenues side, we will see a situation in which the amount that has been invested to stabilize the economy and the likely stimulus to come, they will put some pressure around how we are going to be dealing with the inevitable increase in deficits and in debt. And on that, as I said, low interest rates help. They allow us to kind of move the problem in the future, but they don't solve it. So we will have to think about what is the right way for gradually, over time, addressing what we do now so well and so timely, which is a very big boost of public expenditures. Our message to everybody actually is very unusual for the IMF. Please spend more. And then we add, but keep the receipts. We don't want accountability to be lost, accountability to the taxpayers. But obviously we will have to be thinking about gradually paying for what we spend now. And in my book, thinking of where there is a political momentum of that for carbon taxes, not a bad thing. The price of carbon is incredibly low globally, on average, $2. The IMF analysis says, well, if we want to transition to low carbon, the right incentive, the appropriate price of carbon to stick to a world that is not devastated by 3 to 4 degree temperature, Celsius temperature rise, the right price is $75. Now, I am the first to admit that we have to be thinking of acceptability, how that can be done. And in some, as you know, in some jurisdictions, it is being done, and more jurisdictions, more countries are coming on board saying, hey, I don't want to tax everybody, and I don't want to tax labor. I want to find a different source of revenues. I am not saying this is the only way. In some countries, there is space for indirect taxation, where you actually tax the consumers. So those who can consume more and have more disposable income, they contribute a little bit more. There are other ways to address this revenue part. But certainly carbon is one of the ways, and I wouldn't hide. I think it is a smart way to gear us up to a better, stronger, more resilient economy. On the expenditure side, the very first I would say is that with oil prices being so low, now is the moment to phase out harmful energy subsidies. No impact on prices, no risk of people getting on the streets, and saving money for more important, better targeted support for those who need that support. And again, on the expenditure side, I certainly hope to see public investments going in directions that are good for more inclusive growth, like think of internet. I would expect that countries would equalize their communities by making rapidly investments. Great, by the way, for public-private partnerships. Great for the business community to benefit from. And we will have to see more attention to to job-rich direction of public expenditures. I have already talked about investing in people. I cannot imagine that we come out on the other side of this crisis and we forget that we got in this mess. We had to stop the world because our health systems were unprepared to deal with the pandemic. You know, I don't think we will be forgiven if that is to ever happen again.
Kristalina, we have entered the last stage of this dialogue, but we hope to have many more dialogues with you. I'm going to try to summarize a couple of the questions and allow you to have the final word. You can answer any part of it that you want. I just want to say that Tom Donahue, when he began to run the chamber in the 1990s, he asked me to make sure that the U.S. Chamber did everything it can to ensure the replenishment of the IMF. This was during the 1990s when there was a great debate about the role of the IMF. I think you've answered the questions today about how important the IMF is to ensure that we have a global recovery and that we, each country plays a role, but the IMF plays such a critical role in not only looking at policy prescriptions, but in helping countries deal with debt loads that are just unrecognizable 6 months ago. So we thank you for the service that you are providing. We thank you for the service that the IMF is providing, and you can continue to count on the U.S. Chamber and our business community to be advocates. So with that, one of the questions that I think you can answer in the end is, there is now naysayers out there about multilateral institutions. A lot of people think that going nationalistic is the better approach, as opposed to thinking about our own role in the United States or in Europe or in China, but also contributing to the whole. You cannot confront a global pandemic without looking at our global response as a community. So how would you respond to those naysayers? One. Two, what do you think are your parting shots for the business community? What should we be doing and thinking about? Your final thoughts there. And three, how do we keep these dialogues going? Because there's so many areas you touched upon, and we want to be a part of those contributions to your dialogues going forward on the issues that you raised today, whether it's dealing with income inequality, whether it's dealing with the growth agenda, whether it's looking at trade policy. So we'd like to keep that dialogue. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Well, thank you very much. One very clear lesson from the pandemic is that countries cannot resolve this on their own and do it alone. We have to beat it everywhere so we can be safe at home. And it is, of course, better to beat it working together. Coming to a point when we have a vaccine and treatment and make it accessible to everybody. That collaboration is a source of strength to the world, and it translates into strength for businesses, communities, and families and individuals. I lived on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I started from there. I know what it is to be in a fragmented world, what a loss it is. And I certainly am convinced that in 2020, we are smart enough not to repeat that history of fragmentation. Institutions like mine, they're wonderful public good. We have 189 countries being our owners. And the proof of the pudding is in the number has been growing up over time, not down. We are coming together, able to sort out differences. And of course, this is the foundation for unity of purpose in our world. I actually believe in my heart of heart that majority of people on this planet prefer solidarity and not confrontation and kind of breaking the links that tie us as one world, as one community. In terms of us at the fund, what we have been concentrating on is to deliver on our mandate. We provide an insurance to the world at a time of trouble. We are created for a moment like this, but we are the world's financial firefighter, but we are also a fitness instructor. We are there with countries to give them good advice how they can get stronger policy frameworks so they perform better. And I love this role, and obviously we are very honored that we can play it. So I think my former boss at the bank, Jim Wolfenson, when he was president, had a favorite saying that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So yes, we have to fight this crisis, but we also have to work on how we can underpin through this global collaboration, using our platform, bringing people together. By the way, the US has been phenomenal. The US has been our greatest supporter in having the financial strength we do have. You have been a voice for that. So how we can play our role at the time of crisis, but also in better times for everybody. How we can continue this discussion, I would love us to talk about specific policies during the recovery and what is the business community reflection on that. You create the jobs that provide security and prosperity to hundreds of millions of people. When you are successful, then the world is successful. And if you ask me what is my advice, well, you wouldn't be surprised. What I would say is, yes, aim to do well every single day, every single quarter, but also take a long-term view. How we can have a world that is prosperous, that is resilient, and that is a fair world for our children and grandchildren.
Well, I want to thank the IMF director. I want to thank the IMF director for being with us today, and for all of you for participating in this very informative session. We wish you luck. We'll continue to engage you and the IMF team, and we appreciate the time you gave us this morning. Thank you all for being with us. Please give her a round of applause, even though virtually it's much more difficult. But Tom Donahue, the U.S. Chamber, we're delighted to consider ourselves partners in your effort to ensure we have a healthy and speedy economic recovery through these very difficult and challenging times. Thank you very much for joining us today, Kristalina. Thank you.
Thank you.